Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. So, hi, everybody. Glad to have you here and joining. This will be one of our last sessions, I think, unless we have some grand plan moving forward. But the plan today is primarily two things. Dr. Chang is going to talk to us about Bayes, and again, a very interesting approach that's been around a long time and has had kind of a rebirth. In some statisticians' minds, it's never gone away. It's still very powerful. And then I'm going to talk about the workflow that you see here that I sent you all. Something I probably should have done a long time ago. I'm doing it with the Australian audience, meaning I send them the workflow, so all they have to do is plug in the data and follow along. And it saves time and misunderstandings, in other words. And I'm sorry I didn't think about that sooner. In terms of the changes for the newest orange, is two things that are of note. One is there's a new category called transform. And all they did is they took data that was really a large category and took out those things that modified data and created a new module over here. So that's one thing. Secondly, for whatever reason, only they can understand, they put correlations, which used to be under transform, under unsupervised. So if you find you think it disappeared, that's where it went. So those are the only two. Let me look. Yeah, those are the only two changes. A reminder, always go to the add on section and look to see if there's any updates that need to be updated. So you click on it, it updates. You have to restart Orange, but do look for the updates because it may make a difference and correct any bugs and so forth. I did want to point out that I am working, I'll bring up, see if this will show, okay. As I mentioned, my goal was to have a textbook that was a lot more formal. Let me try to get rid of this menu. A lot more formal than what we currently have. So it's better organized, there's more content, there's more footnotes, many more references. Everything's categorized as tables and figures. And so it's a much more formal dissertation about data science. Still talks about Orange, but much more about data science. We don't know the future of this for sure. We'll find out here soon whether the workshop we propose for AMIA for their fall conference, if that's accepted, then I think I'll take this more seriously. If it's not accepted, we'll just have to see. And let me see. I think so. I'm at the pausing point. If Dr. Chang, you want to go ahead, you want to share screen and present Bayes?
I need one of you to enable participant sharing.
Okay. I changed it to multiple. See if that does it.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Good morning. If some of you have attended the course under the ABIM. And so I thought we spend a few more slides on Bayes than we did during the course because it has a lot of clinical relevance. And I know at least Farrell, if not more of you, have had a lot of exposure and experience with Bayes, or at least a disciple of Bayes, I should say. So feel free to hop on and make a comment so we can all learn together. All right. Let me see. Interesting. For some reason, my play button is hidden somewhere. Can you see?
We see your screen.
Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. It's the Zoom button hit the play button. Okay. So, all right. So Thomas Bayes was from the 1700s and was a British Protestant reverend, actually, who had an affinity for math and was sort of a polymath as well as a philosopher. So he really was the progenitor of the theorem that's named after him. Here's a trivia question on a Saturday morning for you. Who is this then, and why is this person important? Anybody? Farrell, you sound like really.
Is he Wellington?
No. Farrell, you're such an expert on Bayes. I thought you would know. Anybody else? Well, if it wasn't for Pierre-Simon Laplace, who was a French mathematician and statistician, we would not be talking about Bayes today because just like all of my other heroes like Mozart and Van Gogh, they were not known for the gravity of their work until after they passed away, right? So unfortunately, Thomas Bayes, and I'll tell you about a book that you can read for the fun facts of Bayes' theorem, but it wasn't until Pierre-Simon Laplace, almost, I think 50 years later, recognized the importance of Bayes' theorem and brought it to light. And then after that, as Bob and I were talking about, Bayes still didn't get the respect for several hundred years until more recently. I think the whole naive Bayes classifier that you learn from data science was partly responsible for sort of a resurgence of the importance of Bayes' theorem. And then the COVID pandemic, I'll show an example later also that contributed to that as well. But Pierre-Simon Laplace deserves credit for recognizing the significance of Bayes' theorem and then presented it in different mathematical societies to kind of maintain the Bayes' theorem as a concept. But Farrell, since you mentioned Wellington, did Wellington have something to do with Bayes' theorem?
Absolutely nothing. I was wondering, I thought, who is that guy? I don't know. And what's the connection you're going to show?
I thought, wow, I thought I knew Thomas Bayes, but I didn't recognize him. Okay.
No,
so
but I think the one thing about Laplace is I think that these guys, when did they live? What years did you say they were around?
Laplace was like 1750s to 18.
And I think until that time, the whole concept of probability was just an undiscussed, unknown issue. And my son said to me, but no, people have been gambling forever. And no, they believed in Lady Luck and they believed it was in the gods. There was no concept of probability until these guys came around.
Yeah. And then when it was discussed, it was kind of not respected as a real concept, mathematical concept. So we really owe it to these two gentlemen for really giving us what we have today. So I think most of you are familiar with this. So the key part of this is the class prior probability, or what you know that makes a difference. And it has, as Farrell and I said in a previous meeting, I think I challenge everyone to find a less understood, less appreciated mathematical concept in clinical medicine. I don't think I can come up with any, because I was asked that one time. What do I think is a statistical methodology that's the least appreciated, what people don't understand? I don't even think they teach it in medical school these days, because I asked a few medical students, what's their understanding of Bayes' theorem? Because I get medical students that rotate through the clinic every week, and they had not even heard of it, believe it or not. So they were graduating from medical school, from good, I can't name the medical school, but it was a good medical school. So it is astounding to me, and probably to Farrell and Bob and other people too, that they don't seem like this is not even being mentioned in medical schools. Not surprised, but the basic discussion that's interesting from a data science perspective is the Bayesian versus the frequentist schools of statistics. So the biggest difference, as we just talked about, is this prior knowledge, what you can bring to the table to this situation or condition from a mathematical perspective. And that's the prior knowledge, prior probability. So Bayesian embraces it. The frequentist actually not only do they not embrace it, they actually are oppositional to that. If you read some of the works by frequentists, obviously the main objection from the frequentist camp is that the Bayesian probability is very subjective, or it's based on logic, but that's the whole point of the Bayes theorem, is that you do have some subjectivity, whereas the frequentists claim that they're much more objective and it's based on proportion. So there's a degree of belief from the Bayesian camp, and then the frequentist is, as the name implies, all about frequency. So the basic philosophical divide is based on this whole concept of prior belief, and then obviously you build models and then you use data to make a decision. But this prior belief is a huge, sort of created this huge schism between the two schools of thought. Now this sort of conflict through the decades have gone back and forth. And as I said, because of naive Bayes as a classifier now, and also I think recent pandemics and other medical situations render, I think, the Bayes theorem a little bit more relevant to clinical practice, but again, still probably underappreciated. Any other thoughts, Farrell, Bob? Okay, can I ask what camp you're in, or do you just say doesn't matter? Farrell, what camp are you in? Are you in the Bayesian camp, or are you appreciating everything anyway?
I'm in the Bayesian camp, but I find it a lot easier to operationalize frequentist statistics, and it's not so easy to operationalize Bayesian stuff. But that's because I learned Bayesian much later than I learned frequentist. But if I had half the opportunity, I would use Bayesian more. Also, Bayesian is a lot more computationally intensive. So you can need computational resources very quickly that you wouldn't need if you're doing frequentist. But if I had my druthers, I would do Bayesian all the time.
Yeah, I was just about to say that one of the disadvantages of Bayes approach is that computationally gets, it's definitely more intensive than frequentist, but it can also get intensive very quickly if you start dialing in the prime probabilities. Bob, any thoughts from you or anyone else?
I mean, I would use both, but I wanted to bring up the criticism of Bayes in certain scenarios where you don't know prior probability. How is that handled?
Like the pandemic, right? When it first got started.
Right. That would be
such a new disease. Yeah. And then just, go ahead.
In those cases, you have what are called uninformative priors or uniform priors, that whatever you're trying to measure, the parameter of everything, you say it could be wide, massive, and you have a very low, very flat distribution of probabilities. Yeah. And so there are ways around it. And at that point, your data quickly becomes the informative of the posterior probability. But then what's supposed to happen is that anybody who ever did a study like yours, whatever their posterior probabilities are supposed to be your prior probabilities. I don't know that everybody does that, and studies aren't always so easy to make the last person's priors, the last person's posteriors your priors, but it's supposed to be what you do.
Yeah. No, ideally, I think hopefully clinical research will be more appreciative of Bayes as a concept, especially with federated learning that's hopefully in the next few years, because that's ideally set up for that, right? So, as we trade insights and not data. Yeah, so I think I have, just like cognitive computing, I think some of you heard, I have great hopes for Bayes in the future. It just isn't appreciated as much, but I think when people start seeing this Markovian approach to clinical research, I think they're going to appreciate this more. And then, so when you look at a clinical case, like from the emergency room, and by the way, I think even though the pandemic being a new disease was not really well set up for Bayes, but whatever we learned, as Farrell said, can be your knowledge that you can apply. So it doesn't mean that you can't do this with new diseases. It just means that you have to find a few pieces of knowledge and then build that in. So in a clinical decision case, the major difference, because for clinicians you want to know, so what's the big deal? What's the big difference between frequentist and Bayesian? imagine yourself in an emergency room with a case, and let's say someone comes in with chest pain. I'm a cardiologist, I get that a lot. And then so if you're a frequentist, then you would get a minimal history, and you would go right to the examination, get an EKG and an echocardiogram, and you come up with a diagnosis. So if you're more of a Bayesian clinician, then you would absolutely place a lot of emphasis on family history, the history of the patient, the prevalence of heart disease in that region of the country, and put that as priors or prior probabilities or knowledge into your model, mental model this is. And then you do examination and diagnosis. So there's an upside and downside, obviously, even in the Bayesian approach. I happen to think more Bayesian and then a frequentist. I do think, obviously, and I think especially seasoned clinicians really appreciate the history and prevalence. And I think this pandemic has really shown that prevalence meant everything. And especially when we first started out with COVID testing, that was not particularly good. Any comments and thoughts there on the clinician perspective of Bayesian versus frequentist thinking? I mean, no clinician is going to ignore history or prevalence, but we definitely, I think clinicians I work with definitely place different levels of emphasis on all of that. Yeah, Bob?
Well, I just started to say it has to be you have to think through that. For instance, when you look at the prevalence of heart disease in women, it's low, which may bias you to think they can't have heart disease, but their symptoms are atypical and often can fool you. So again, it kind of has to be a blend of the two, I think.
Right. Yeah, you leverage the strengths of both of these approaches, right? And then and I think actually in some ways neutralize the weakness of the other. Farrell, you look like you're about to.
Yeah. In the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they speak a lot about how us humans have a natural inclination to put too much weight on the representativeness of anything we see. So if we see a case that has all the hallmarks of something, we are completely swayed by it. And we do this a lot with cultural bias or stereotyping as well.
Yeah.
But what's the way that, and that can mislead you because you become overly confident or overly convinced that something is or isn't. Whereas the way it really works well is to say, what is the baseline rate of something? And then as information is added that makes you increase your suspicion or decrease your suspicion, it should increase or decrease your suspicion from that baseline. And a Bayesian analysis does that very well. The way we actually, us humans, really think it's, we do a little bit of Bayesian, but we do a lot of over-representativeness of specific information.
Yeah. Now I introduced Sherlock Holmes to my daughter about a year ago. She's read every book that I can get her, and she's now reading Enola Holmes. But it's really, and I talk about this during the course, it's really good to kind of get to know Sherlock Holmes again in terms of his way of thinking. And it's not actually as straightforward as deductive reasoning, which is what the whole world writes about. He actually does inductive and deductive and abductive reasoning. We won't have time to go into all of that, but you wonder if he was a secret Bayesian as well, because he's been wrong, right? We know that he was wrong in at least 3 cases, but he, I think underneath it all, he has a Bayesian component for sure. And then I just want to put this slide up because, Bayesian and frequentist is not the only 2 camps. If you read, by the way, if you haven't read this book, this is a really classic, one of my top 10 recommendations for AI and data science. It's called The Master Algorithm. I don't know, Bob, have you seen it or read it?
I have not read it.
Okay, I think you would definitely enjoy it. It talks about the 5 schools or 5 tribes, as he call it. Obviously, we're in the connectionists era with neural networks, obviously there's overlap amongst these 5 tribes. But it's kind of good to understand the evolution of these 5 tribes. in terms of the history. And he does a really good job talking about the Bayesians and how they're based on probabilistic inferences. And we know about naive Bayes as a classifier. He talks about the Markovian process or hidden Markov model as another way to demonstrate the Bayesian philosophy. And then the evolutionaries, analogizers, and symbolists also have their place in data science in general. So it's a little bit technical, but I think not beyond what people that come to this session on Saturdays can handle. So it's a really, really good read. I'm thinking about reading it for the second time this summer, actually. So has anyone else read the Master Algorithm or make a comment? No one? Okay. He also writes occasionally for different magazines, so I think it's good. And he's, you know, a rare breed, a data hardcore machine learning data scientist who can explain things well enough that a layperson can understand in interviews, at the same time have a lot of substance. He writes on the future of algorithms and machine learning also in different magazines. So he's a kind of a good author to kind of keep abreast of. And in a way that without giving you the entire punchline in the book, his point is that there is no master algorithm that takes care of everything. You kind of have to understand the nuances and strengths and weaknesses of each of these tribes. And he sort of draws the analogy about, you know, like the traditional fable with different people feeling different parts of the elephant and think they have it figured out. And it's kind of nice to be able to be very facile and flexible with different tribes of the machine learning. And just a couple of references that I think I'll try to get the PDFs of these to forward them to you. One I talked about in the course is the Fagan's nomogram. And this is a very recent article that was published in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, of all places, talks about Bayes' theorem, COVID-19, and screening tests. You know, back when screening tests weren't so good and the pandemic was really taking hold in cities like New York, there was concern that so many people were deemed not to have COVID when the screening test was negative in a place that was very, very much struggling with COVID. So I think this nomogram, usually you don't see the Fagan's nomogram. I think Fagan was a pathologist, right? Bob, wasn't he a pathologist?
I think that's right.
Yeah, who got really interested in interpreting tests and what it meant for the clinician. So this is a particularly good Fagan's nomogram because usually they just show you one part of this. And I like this because I haven't seen, and there's a more modern version of this, by the way, I just couldn't find that diagram. It tells you if the prior or pre-screening test probability is low versus moderate and versus high, with the same likelihood ratio of the screening test, what's your post-test probability? So in other words, if someone comes in with just mild cold symptoms and your suspicion for COVID is there, but it's not really, really high, then with the screening test and the capability, your probability, even if the test is positive, is going to be, the disease probability is going to be relatively low. And the converse of that is if you're coming in with a fever 103 and you're having respiratory issues during a pandemic, so you have high pre-test probability, and based on the screening test, your probability could be equally as high or even higher. So, and I think that's something that I know. I travel the world doing clinical medicine and do rounds. I find that perhaps, and those of you from other countries can chime in too, I think Americans are the most guilty of over-reliance on screening tests, just because we have such easy access to a lot of screening tests. And we rely a little bit too much on screening tests. Whereas if you go to countries with less resources, I think the clinicians are superior in terms of having that pre-test probability figured out in their head before they have the screening test, or in a lot of cases, they don't have the screening test readily available, especially advanced imaging tests. So I think it's an interesting sort of observation I made through many years of traveling abroad doing medicine. So some of you have, I think, practiced medicine abroad. What do you think about the Bayes and relevance to clinicians from the US versus elsewhere? So
I don't know that they're thinking Bayesian more or less. There's just more of a reliance on history and examination and cognition rather than checkbox, check these tests. All right. And you full, complete and utter reliance on the result that comes back.
Where did you practice medicine? It sounds like you practice medicine abroad, right? Or
in South Africa, England, and in Canada.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, maybe they're unintentional Bayesians, but they definitely, I just have the feeling a lot of times, like, I'll just give you a quick example. In the US, and as I'm a pediatric cardiologist, if a pediatrician is sending a kid in for even an innocent murmur, all the pediatric cardiologists I know, including myself, will get an echocardiogram. I don't see that in other countries where you really have to not only listen to the kid, but you have to be really almost sure there's something unusual happening before the echocardiogram is being ordered. So
I don't know how much of my information is 30 years old. I don't know what happens there now. But when I was in medical school in the 1980s, probably the most important thing that was ever stressed is you never, ever, ever order a test without first doing a history and examination and fully exploring the options. And then you carefully choose special investigations. The idea of ordering a special investigation before you've seen the patient is completely heretical.
yeah. Welcome to
I
the
agree with
US.
her.
Yeah.
My experience is also about 30 years old. So
I like that.
It's the same. Yeah. But I agree with Farrell that it was almost heretical to suggest a study before a physical and a history.
Yeah. Our practice is spent on getting prior authorizations for the echocardiogram before the patient even gets seen. And you know what? Insurance companies don't mind it. So, because they know that because what the other kind of practice from our most senior cardiologist when I showed up here was he'll follow the kid for once a year for a number of years and just follow the murmur. But the thing is, it's more expensive to do that than just get an echocardiogram, and that's most likely to be normal. So the insurance companies have fallen into approving the echocardiogram because they're hoping that it's a one-time consult that will be done instead of coming back every year for 10 years or 20 years. So anyway, so there's an element of protecting against malpractice also if you miss something. So it gets complicated for sure. But and then this other reference that I found this week when I was researching for this talk, I think is really good also. It reveals that the Fagan's nomogram is actually a two-step process, because you have to think about the pre-test probability and post-test probability that is commonly known by the Fagan's nomogram. But built into that Fagan's nomogram is the likelihood ratio, which takes into account the diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, because that changes, as we saw with COVID, it changed during the COVID pandemic. So that impacts on what your likelihood ratio is going to be for the screening test. And perhaps that's another good topic at some point in the future, Bob, is what is likelihood ratio in terms of screening tests? That's an important concept. Like Bayes and Fagan's nomogram, underappreciated and more importantly, underutilized to a large degree to benefit our patients' outcomes.
And I might mention that all of these are available in phone apps, evidence-based medicine phone apps, where it can quickly calculate the likelihood ratio and all the rest.
There's also, I don't know if any of you have come across a video series called StatQuest. Does that sound familiar to some of you? I mentioned it at the board course. It's, if you can put up with the guy saying, it's actually an outstanding video series on a lot of different statistical methods and tools. Definitely worth looking at, I still watch it to this day. I watched it throughout my school years. When I really need to understand something that I can't understand from class, I actually I know my Stanford mentors would totally barbecue me, but I go to StatQuest and look at it because they have a way of explaining something difficult and make it understandable. So I would highly recommend it. And they talk about Bayes and naive Bayes even. Yeah.
And so just to let you know, the guy just came out with a book. So
What?
if you don't, yeah, so it's basically all of his like illustrations
Oh.
from like all of his YouTube videos like in a book. So if you
Oh,
want
wow.
to watch, like read all of it without, hearing the songs,
Yeah.
you can get the book.
Can you hold that closer to the camera, please?
Yes, let me turn off.
What's his
my
name?
Video. Josh Stamer.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, I turned off my video. I meant to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hold it a lot closer.
Yeah, because I have to turn off my background, I think, in order.
I'm gonna
to
get it
choose-
right.
No, you're doing well. Hold the book up. Go
Okay,
up a little bit.
all right.
There we go.
Okay, because I think my background sometimes.
StatQuest.
Yeah. Oh, I see. All right.
Yeah. I was just
Hold it close to your face. There we go. That's
Okay.
it. That's good.
Close to my face work. Yeah.
How did you come across this book?
It's
Laura?
Amazon. I saw it on LinkedIn because I follow the guy on LinkedIn and he says, I'm putting all my illustrations in a book. And it's really great. It's like literally got all of his stuff from the YouTube video in a book.
I'm
It's
also
on
amazed-
Amazon. Yeah.
I'm also often amazed how many data scientists, statisticians have never heard of this series, and they teach all the time. And I always say, just tell your students to start watching these because it'll make you look good. So, because this guy just has an uncanny ability to explain something really difficult in less than 5 minutes. So it's a definite high level art to do that. And then if you're looking for a not too nerdy summer read, but kind of a fun facts kind of thing on Bayes, this is probably the best book I've come across in that category. It's called The Theory That Would Not Die. And it was actually by an author who is not a data scientist, which explains why it's so fun to read. He talks about a lot of the ways that Bayes was used that was underappreciated. So she's definitely a Bayesian. She gives a nice talk too that you can search for. She talks about how it was used to crack the Enigma code with Alan Turing, and there's some references to healthcare also, particularly screening tests. So it's kind of a fun read. It's a couple of nights of fun reading for you if you want to pursue that this summer too. All right, with that, just want to thank all of my team for giving me the time to spend time with you.
Thank you, Anthony. That was very helpful.
Sure.
I have a question actually that actually ties in quite well with what Bob is going to talk about with natural language, because I'm thinking about Bayes and it makes a lot of sense and it sort of incorporates that clinician intuition. But right now, I feel like a lot of the information that is about patient history, it's in text, right? It's in the EHR. So if we're building AI models, what do you feel like? How likely is it that the AI models can take into account all of this history that a physician would just intuitively go to look for? But would an AI model be, would they be able to build it in a sophisticated way enough to take into account all of that history versus more like a frequentist approach where, this is the data we have right now, let's just calculate the probability.
Bob and
Well, I don't think we're there. I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical where we can think longitudinally. We're somebody in the ICU, we're collecting information, we're staying there, we're getting exam. Things are evolving over the 20 minutes you're with the patient, and you're absorbing and calculating all of that simultaneously, if you will, and using some clinical judgment. I just don't think AI is capable of doing that at this point.
I think it's going to be, as we start talking about having more cognitive elements into machine and deep learning, I actually think Bayes is going to come back big in that discussion, because what you really, you can machine learn everything and deep learn everything, but the way a clinician thinks is not really captured because we have a piece of evidence, and then we're going to weight that evidence, which is typically not done well. And then we might change our direction in terms of screening tests, right? Based on that, the weight of that evidence. Part of the problem, and we talked about this before, part of the problem with EHR is it doesn't give you weights of things, right? It just gives you a list of things. And we have to find a way to weight different things. And then on top of that, factor in prior probability of things, right? So now Watson was trying to do some of that, but it's still very, very difficult. But I think with NLP coming in strong this decade, I think we should be able to find ways of incorporating the clinician's thinking into tools that we use for AI and sort of take advantage of the best of both worlds, right? How clinicians think, lots of shortcuts that is not factored into computational ways of finding out answers that we should be able to leverage to not just decrease computational burden, but just to do a better job of making predictions.
Flora Wan, was your question that if we already have electronic health records that have tons of free text written by doctors, that free text can be mined for clues that doctors might have missed? And if you ingested all of that free text into natural language processing, could you not suggest a diagnosis to the doctor he or she had not considered or that he had long forgotten about? Is that kind of what you were thinking?
Yeah, sort of, because we were talking about, understanding the prior probability. And so that a lot of the prior probability is buried right now in the patient's history. So I'm wondering like how we can take, that into account when we're building something like AI.
Well, first of all, I agree with Bob and I disagree with Bob, which means I actually agree and disagree with myself, but I don't, in other words, I don't know. But so two things crossed my mind. The first thing is, yes, it can be done. I don't think it can replace the doctor, but it should certainly be able to support the doctor to force the doctor to consider something he might not have considered. And if you can use one of these machine learning ones that actually, first of all, uses machine learning to come up with an answer, but then does the explained machine learning, which might not be how it got it in the first place, but these computational systems have become quite good of trying to explain why it might be related. It might make a doctor consider something that he might not otherwise consider, which means you add it to the differential. And if it can also offer a test that would increase or decrease the probability of something, now you're really onto something good. And if it does it for every patient, it's going to be ignored. If it does it for one patient a clinic, or one patient a day, or one patient a week, that is certainly something you could compel people to consider and think about. There's another little wrinkle in this, which I've encountered when I was working on a previous project. Everybody thinks that the patient gives the history, the doctor listens, and when the doctor comes to documenting or dictating that history, the doctor then documents the history. Nonsense. It's not how it happens. It's what it appears to be, but that's an illusion. You listen to the history, you do the examination, you have a discussion with the patient, and at the end of that, you have a working diagnosis in your head. And if you're particularly pensive, you have a differential diagnosis as well. Maybe if you come from an internal medicine bent, but sure as heck not if you come from a surgical bent, you have a differential diagnosis list in your mind. You then document the history and the examination in a way that supports your assessment and plan, which means the histories that are in the records, whether it's in the old handwritten ones or in the dictated ones, is flooded with confirmation bias, absolutely flooded. And on the one hand, you have to do this. One of the reasons I avoided family practice or internal medicine like the plague is there were so many red herrings to deal with. Do you know what I mean by a red herring?
Yep.
Does everybody know what's meant by a red herring in clinical practice?
The curveball.
A red herring is somebody gives you some information. but it's not related to anything. And if you try and pursue it, it sends you down down a rabbit hole, and you never get it. On a wild goose chase, you never find it. And sometimes you have to say, I'm going to ignore that. And in fact, what I didn't like about internal medicine is it wasn't just a whole lot of red herrings. It was a whole fish market of red herrings. I couldn't stand it. But in those red herrings, some of it is red herrings and some of it is the kernel that the doctor's missing because he or she was too committed to his own assessment and plan. And so the documented history is filled with confirmation bias. I think what would be incredibly valuable in these natural language processing models is to take those dictations by the doctor, but also even more is patients sometimes write into their chart. That's the most valuable. Anybody using Epic or MyChart have people typing in their own messages to the doctor. And in there, you will find some symptoms that have not been processed through confirmation bias. And I think that that part of the history is most valuable. And also, if we go to a system like Nuance, the DAX, where the AI is listening to the patient before the doctor gets to filter it through confirmation bias, in there are clues. Now, it might be that the clues just, maybe it's so rare and so in between, it's nothing, but I don't think that that should be discarded without first being looked at. And I think that would be incredibly valuable.
Also, maybe not everyone here knows this interesting factoid. How much time goes by when a patient starts to describe the history before the doctor interrupts the patient? It varies from subspecialty to subspecialty, but what's the average time you think a patient gets to speak about what brought them in before a clinician interrupts?
Yeah, there was a study that said that's less than 30 seconds.
It's 7 seconds. So I was shocked until I realized I kind of do the same thing. Well, I think I have it figured out in 5 seconds, and I kind of go right into my line of questioning, when in fact people think that you should just listen and have this attitude of empathy to listen, because that's what they want, actually, more than anything else, is someone to listen. And then you can have your confirmation bias, but at least you listen to them. But we're guilty of two things in a row, right? We're guilty of not being patient, listening. And on top of that, it's worse. We add confirmation bias. No wonder we miss the diagnosis so often.
This is to Flora's point, or question a few minutes ago, as probably a very heavy clinician and just trying to learn this technical space with you all. I don't think, Flora, the goal should absolutely be the right diagnosis. I would argue it should be optimizing the process. As we've gone through COVID in the last 2 years, I'm a colon surgeon. We're seeing later and later colon cancers. My breast surgery colleagues are telling me the same thing. I think the power of NLP and the artificial intelligence algorithms in general will be to optimize to the patient, to point out simple information from primary care doctors. Did Joe have his colonoscopy or not? Did Mrs. Jones get her mammogram? Are frequently missing, and patients and families don't know. And then my final comment at all is that I think—
Ken, you don't even need NLP for that. You just need a better data and intake infrastructure,
well,
which hopefully NLP will help to drive, right?
But that's almost my point. I mean, this AI stuff is fascinating and wonderful, and I'm listening and I'm learning from all of you. But out in the field, you're right, we just need bread and butter better.
Yeah. But Ken, I always say, I gave a talk in London one time, and the NHS director asked me, Dr. Chang's great. We kind of see the future with you, but here at the NHS hospitals, we're still faxing. It's like, how do we reconcile that North Star and that on the ground reality? And I said, if there is no North Star like AI and all the great things we expect, what's going to make you change? You're going to be mired in status quo forever. There's nothing that's going to give you an incentive. So he thought that was a good point, that, you need an incentive. And it's like dessert, right? You're going to have to go through the meal to get to dessert. And AI is sort of like the wonderful dessert that you want, but you better, eat something nutritious before you get there, as our parents have told us. So I kind of look at the data, IT infrastructure, all the things that you mentioned, Ken, as ways that hopefully will get us to the reward, which is the AI part that will enable precision medicine. But I'm practicing, as you know, so I totally feel your pain too. So the point's really, really well taken. Bob, do you want to try to field some of the questions that the people have addressed us?
There's a raised hand. I'm not seeing that on my board here. Sedalia, I think.
Sedalia, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's me. Just to add up on the point of Anthony's, because I work on a lot of projects within the NHS on looking at the clinical data and trying to optimize it. And it's been quite interesting to see how our very old-fashioned way of thinking within the NHS. And I think they don't even know how many patients they have. They don't even know how much patients per cohort to then help and predict, how much workforce do they need, how much, how to put a business case up so they can get more, more space and plan for the 5 years that that is going to be an increase every 5 years of 5% of patients with those specific diseases. So it's been quite interesting to see that. But definitely I agree. I think there is a lot of baseline work to be done, especially at the clinical level, to get the right variables in. So then you can start doing some artificial intelligence to help you plan and model long-term your needs in a more automatic way, or at least as much automatic as possible. But it's been quite interesting to see all those challenges. I was expecting that things were a little bit more futuristic as we speak here, but they are not at all. So
we have to keep pushing the agenda. And
yes.
So Dalia, as you know, you have at least half a dozen of the world's best AI and medicine centers in the UK that you can totally take leverage for the future of healthcare and population health in the UK. So it's almost like you have disproportionately more talent in this area than most countries. So NHS, it would be to their advantage to really get the data and infrastructure well organized and coordinated to take advantage of that amazing pool of talent from the home of Alan Turing. So
yeah, I think they already have at the national level and CCG level very good level of data to at least have the QoF indicators and so on, but a lot needs to be then more at the kind of local level. But there is projects in plan, and it's going to be interesting. But yeah,
it's like the Apollo space program, right? Landing on the moon with the North Star, but gosh, so many benefits and dividends came from NASA. And I'm hoping the same will have for AI medicine. That's the North Star, precision medicine with AI. But it means that we have to up our game in a lot of different areas, which really should be done anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you haven't seen Return to Space, I recommend it because there are a lot of analogies I've drawn to AI and medicine. I know it to some people it felt like a SpaceX commercial, but I thought it was pretty well done. It's called Return to Space. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. So it's very inspiring that you can have a bold vision going to Mars and drive a lot of dividends along the way to benefit people, in general. So, Bob, did you? Any other comments? Or I think Irene and Doreen made some good comments about equity in healthcare, which we can build in for the future, because we have a lot of unintentional biases and also systemic flaws that need to be neutralized. I call AI potentially in the future the equalizer, right? So hopefully that will get there, but it might exaggerate inequities for the short term, but I'm hoping that it will neutralize the inequities in the long term.
And part of my point, this was building on the confirmation bias point that was made a few minutes ago, was that even before there's the opportunity for confirmation bias, sometimes the data doesn't even, the doctor doesn't even have a chance of hearing the history or the story or the context. So it's kind of a garbage in, garbage out. If you don't even have a chance of getting the data, then it's not going to be in the system to be able to analyze. That's not new. It's not new with AI, certainly, but it's a factor to be considering.
I think one way that we can tie many of these concepts together, remember you were talking about we interrupt patients after 7 seconds. I've heard it's about 11 seconds, but so what? The difference between 4 seconds. And I've tried to adopt the attitude of STFU, which is too rude to express, to do out the acronym, but it's to keep quiet and listen. And first of all, when you do STFU, the vast majority of patients do not do what you fear, which is to go on for 5 or 10 minutes. Most of them finish within about 45, maybe a minute and a quarter. But there's also some famous guys, probably Osler. Every famous saying in medicine always came down to Osler. Something about listen to the patient, they're telling you the diagnosis. And I can't tell you how often when I have exercised impulse control and done STFU, that the patient tells me something, say, oh, thank you for telling me that. I hadn't even considered that. Oh, what a gift you've just given me. God, you made my life easy. I would have completely missed that. I would have forgotten to think to ask you about that. Thank God you told me. So this whole idea of keep quiet and listen is really useful. Now, the thing is, where I'd like AI to come in again is, wouldn't it be nice if there were ways of getting the complete patient story, maybe even the 20-minute version of it, but that I didn't need to listen to all 20 minutes. Maybe I needed to only listen to the first minute or minute and a half, but I had an AI in the background doing summarization for me. Oh God, how beautiful that would be. So I can see AI and human doctors working together excellently. I think a lot of this could be research projects right now, but it's a matter of how do we implement it and how do we get it into the workflows and the work process.
Yeah, I think it'll be a great demonstration of the synergy between humans and machines to be able to extract information so that we don't end up spending an hour with each patient, but we have every benefit of what we would have done, or what we would have gotten if we had spent an hour with that patient. The computer should be able to expedite those things for us. I totally agree. It's someone asked at our office hour, no, why can't Elon Musk just take over healthcare? And I said, you know what, healthcare makes going to Mars relatively straightforward, because you can't have an engineer running healthcare because he or she's going to have to figure out how something complex is working like healthcare, because it involves human beings. Going to Mars is I wasn't kidding to say that's relatively straightforward, because it's probably thousands of engineering steps to get there, but they're much more predictable with much less fuzziness and nuance than healthcare. Healthcare is in a totally different magnitude in terms of how complex it is. So I'm afraid that Elon Musk, without clinicians helping him, won't be able to solve healthcare. And he'll get frustrated. He's not a patient man. So he'll just say enough, just like Google has, just like other Microsoft has. They just said enough. We can't keep spending this kind of money into healthcare. IBM, another one. So a lot of big titans in Silicon Valley have fallen prey to healthcare, and I'm afraid even Elon Musk won't have the patience for it. But I think Elon Musk plus a small army of clinicians can solve it, but it won't be one without the other. Bob, you've been around medicine for a long time. Do you agree that it's not as straightforward as outsiders might think it is, right?
If you just look at the Congress's success with healthcare reform, the answer is obvious that it's a gorilla that nobody wants to tackle or has been able to, either one.
But we have to
U.S. healthcare. Now, that may not be true of other countries, but this this country's healthcare is just so
Yes.
entangled with finances and insurance companies, and everybody has their tentacle into the, the system. It's a nightmare.
He needs a real healthcare czar to run this whole thing.
Uh,
But that won't come. So
to quote a very deep thinking politician, healthcare is complicated. Who knew?
Well, with that, Bob, do you want to? We have such a passionate learning group here. Where would you like to go from here? I love the fact that we're spending once a month an hour on Saturday here, but what do you think? And what do everyone else think too?
Well, let me just get back to the original intent was to finish up with natural language processing. We'll have to do that next month to go over the exercises. And then I'd planned to talk about databases as well, unless people would prefer to go in a different direction. So, because we're pretty well finishing the modules that I had planned. So any input about future direction would be appreciated. So that's the only direction I have right now, finish up NLP and start on databases and simple SQL commands. So feel free to email me and we can disseminate that and we can have a group vote and plan, but we need some time to plan ahead. If somebody wants a lecture on a burning subject, let's say, we need a little bit of lead time, at least 2 weeks to prepare for that.
Maybe we can just set up a schedule of the month and the topics, and if nobody can really comfortably talk about that topic, we can get someone from the outside and make it like a mini, but not be like a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation. No one wants that on a Saturday morning, but maybe as a brief introduction and then a discussion or something on the hot topics.
I see in the chat, Doreen and Cesalia mentioned practical examples or practical exercises, like a workshop. Doreen, can you expand on that?
It's very noisy. I apologize. So just working backwards a problem, like we have a clinical scenario and we have an issue or a problem and we like to work it. So I would like to learn what the steps would be I have to consider in order to have a good model available at the end.
Okay, to some degree, we've tried that with many of the chapters. There are other data sets and whatnot. It would be helpful if you all came up with a data set and challenged us all to approach it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, though, to find data sets at the patient level. So often they're at the government level or state level, let's say. So you're only making statements about population health, if you will. You're not really trying to do a predictive model at the patient level. But if any of you all have data sets you can share that you find to be challenging, I think we could all probably contribute. Whether we'd use Orange to do it or not is another question, but certainly I'd be happy to do that, but I'd have to know what kind of clinical problems or data sets you all are interested in.
Help is coming though. I think NVIDIA is going to put together a whole portfolio of publicly available health data sets to work on. So these companies are thinking of helping. So,
but getting it at the patient level, we'll see if they can, because generally then you have to do city training and all the rest for a lot of this. So it's a huge challenge. So Dale, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's 2 hackathons from the MIT that are coming up if people want to join. One is in Norway and it's free and they all have their data sets. So it's a good practical exercise to work with clinicians, but also data scientists. And I'm trying to organize one with Dr. Leo from the MIT as well in London next year. So if we can join forces of other people that want to participate, I know a lot of you are in the US, but I think there's a community of people that are interested in this. So we can try and work it out. I could try and see if Great Manchester, they are building up portfolio of database of primary care. I can try and see whether they would be willing to share somehow, but I can't promise anything because these things are quite complicated here in the NHS, but I can try and see. But Oxford also has a database, but you have to kind of sign up and he's very strict. But maybe it's something that if it was a group that
Also,
maybe we could try.
Also, my alma mater, Stanford, is putting together quite a few publicly available databases now to encourage data science towards those databases. So I can also look into that.
I think it's all image-based at this point, though, right?
I think they're planning on non-image databases. So
Right.
Because they're trying to get rid of the image, excuse the pun, the image that Amy is all image-based. So,
Right.
so they're trying to get away from that. So yeah, we'll
just
hear more about it next week. So yeah.
I just posted in the chat an article today about 9 Harvard courses related to data science that you all can look through to see if any of them are of interest. They come up from time to time. MIT did it, but apparently MIT's was all theoretical, which is no surprise. You know, trying to find applied stuff is also a challenge because some people just approach it like you should be a PhD and everything we say is aimed at the PhD level, which is just doesn't work with clinicians.
Yeah. Agree. See, I as I said yesterday, a couple of meetings, I see the clinician's role as being almost like an AI architect for healthcare, not AI programmer, you know, because we know the clinical medicine much better. And we should be able to direct these projects to the right questions to begin with, but also the right framework. So that's more like an architect. And I'm not saying data scientists are just like sort of property construction type people, but it's the same kind of relationship.
Yeah, it's just got to be relevant, and sometimes it's not, unfortunately. Okay, well, do
Give
email
Bob lots of feedback. Give Bob lots of feedback. So we'll continue having these Saturday sessions.
Yeah, we're shooting for June the 11th, that Saturday, unless something else comes up at this point, and that we'll plan to do what we talked about. And if you have other topics you want added, please let us know. You can email us. I probably create a group of the people that are on today are the main people that have attended in the last 6 months. So there's no reason we can't have a group to just narrow the discussion among ourselves. So I do appreciate your time today and your input and your discussions. And I look forward to talking to you in June. Bye-bye.